Tool Hut channel. Today, we had a discussion with some scope users about ways to get technicians to start using their scopes. If you've been watching my YouTube channel, you probably see I'm doing a series on get the scope out of the box. This is kind of a discussion with some other people that are using scopes to talk about ideas for getting the scope out of the box. Stand by.
I just kind of wanted to have a conversation about getting shops to use their scope. I don't really want to talk about accessories for scopes, just some ideas for getting shops to use the scopes they have.
Okay, yeah.
I know it's kind of a crazy subject, but I've done a couple of videos on if a shop doesn't have a scope, what to buy, just something cheap. I'm recommended a Handtech scope with some accessories and get it all in for under 500 bucks. And I think that's the purpose of it is not necessarily for them to have a great scope when they're done, but to learn the basics of the scope so they understand what to buy.
Having any scope's better than not having any scope at all. So, even if it is a cheaper one and for 90% of what they're doing or what they're going to need it for, a cheap scope's fine. You and I both know that.
Yeah. And that's kind of the reason I put it together. I've got 4 or 5 different brands of scopes. But I just, to me, the scope is what separates the parts throwers from the diagnostics guys.
Yep.
And I'm sure you've seen that in your, doing mobile diagnostics as well. You feel a lot better going to help a shop that's done. I mean, it's probably a harder diagnosis when you go because the guy's got a scope and understands what he's doing. But at the same time, you probably don't get as many problems from shops like that.
Oh yeah. The guys the shops that use the scope, it's when it says it needs something, it 9 times out of 10, they've taken that extra step and it doesn't, that component fixes it more so than the shops that don't have a scope and if they don't have a scope, then they're really not knowing the diagnostic process anyway. So they're not really verifying powers and grounds or anything else. So that's been my experience.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say that probably less than 10% of my customers use a scope. And and I get calls all the time with guys wanting to buy scopes. And I've kind of changed my attitude the last year or so, year and a half. And I'm not going to sell you a scope. I'm going to teach you how to use the one you got. And if you don't have one, we're going to start you off with something cheap and simple.
Yep.
And because to me, I sell equipment, and there's nothing more disheartening to me than to walk into a shop that doesn't have a scope. And they got a $5,000 Pico sitting on the bottom of the cart. It's unopened and it's 3 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, and that happens quite a bit. Even with the Snap-on scopes and everything else, they bought a scan tool that they didn't realize has a scope attached to it. So when I asked, do you guys have a scope? They're like, nope, but they have it in their hand. I'm testing them. I'll test them. Do you guys have a scope? No, and I can see it right here. And they're like, no, we don't have a lab scope. I was like, you do. Let me show you how to use this and stuff on this 3-wire sensor or what have you. And obviously you need to know kind of what you're looking at, but that's where, practicing on the known goods, don't hook it up to a bad car that's got a CMP fault, because you're not really going to know what you're looking at unless you know what a known good is or what the signal should be. Should it be a 5-volt to pull down? Should it be a pull up? Should it, but that's where they need to use it and use it on a good car, something simple right there under the hood. You don't have to disassemble anything and get familiar with the scope, how it's set up, and because each one functions just a little bit different.
It's basically the same once you learn the basics of the scope.
Everyone's
a little different on the setup, a little different on the buffer rate and stuff like that. But if you get the gist of it, there's the same.
It's voltage over time. So how do you set that up on the screen? Um, and Snap-on's going to be a little bit different than most of the scopes. I think that was the biggest learning curve for me. Once I understood Snap-on, man, you can grab any scope and run with it, because I feel that that's probably the hardest one, because you want to have little time on the screen and then zoom out, so you have good signals and everything. Because if you put too much time on the screen, then it's not capturing everything.
Yeah.
But that's once you understand the limitations of each scope, even expensive scopes like the Snap-on. Once you understand how they function and how they work, it's voltage over time, and how do you set it up? So
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you saw my videos I put together. I put together some 3 basic tests. Well, first of all, the first week I went through the best way to get this. I call it getting the scope out of the box, because most shops have a scope and they're in the box. So let's get it out of the box and let's get using it. I recommend buying a cart, setting it up on a cart so it's easy to get to the leads, and
yep.
And starting that approach with using it. And then yesterday I put a video up of 3 basic tests: a battery test, a alternator test, and a relative compression using voltage. All of them use the same pickup and they're all easy to get to. It's right up to the battery. And it wasn't, yesterday's video wasn't about accuracy or nothing else. It was about hooking up the scope, running these 3 tests, and kind of getting an idea what you were doing.
Right.
And I personally, I think that's a good way to start using the scope. Because I encouraged them to set it up at a 10-minute time base, so you can do a 5-minute battery test with headlights on, and then you can check the alternator and you can do the relative compression all on the same screen.
Yep. No, and those are all 3 very valid tests, so once they understand that, and like you said, it's an easy hookup. It's right there to the battery, and those are, like I said, 3 good tests that you should be doing any time that you have something weird going on or anything else. Because how many guys overlook ripple, for example.
I didn't go over the patterns or nothing like that yesterday. It was more about
getting familiar with it,
hooking it up and using it.
Yep.
And obviously we're going to get more involved with doing the AC ripple and relative compression with an amp clamp if they got one, stuff like that. And show the differences between amp clamp and a voltage. But I just wanted to know from your experience, what are you seeing? What's the best way to get these guys using the scopes that they've got? And I'm not talking about selling them, Bernie scopes or Picos, which are great scopes. Either one of them is a
they are. They're great scopes, and that could be something that you move on to as you get more familiar, or if you become the scope guy and everything. There are some nice functions in it and stuff, but I mean, 9 times out of 10, I'm using my AES U scope, which is what, $150. So I don't use an expensive scope, but it's better than grabbing a meter, in my opinion, and I like seeing those signals.
Yeah.
But what was the question again, Sam? I don't know if I answered that.
From your experience, what do you think is a good way to get the guys starting to use their scopes? What are some tests that you think would be valid for getting them to use their scopes more?
I think you're onto something as far as like doing the ripple test, the battery test, or starting cranking charging system test, all right there. The relative compression, man, that's even moving it up another level right there. I think that's a great test, and like I said, all 3 of those tests right there are right there at the battery, so that's super convenient. Getting familiar with 5-volt sensors, because there's so many of them on the vehicle, and 9 times out of 10, depending on the vehicle, you can for like a cam sensor, they're fairly easy hookups. I would say that would probably be another good test to get there. I like verifying a good ground, and checking the signal that's coming out of it, because we see a lot of we see a lot of circuit code, especially for cam and crank and stuff like that. And some 3-wire sensors seem to trip guys up. At least in my experience. And I mean, some of these are some reputable shops because, they disconnect the sensor and it's got, some of them it will have 5 volts on 2 wires, not realizing that it's a pull down circuit, not a pull up. And they're like, oh, it's shorted to 5 volts. And it's like, but is it, let's, and you can confirm that or confirm that it isn't just by, hooking up to the signal wire. It's not shorted. We do see a pattern here. It's producing something, or grabbing, and this isn't scope based, but even grabbing the test light, and you can pull that circuit down. Once they see that, then they start understanding. But I've shown up to a bunch of shops and they're like, well, it's got 5 volts on two of these wires. And I'm like, that's good. That's how that one's designed. Not all of them, but that trips guys up, and not realizing that biased voltage, so to speak. Which I like seeing that, because that confirms another, wiring integrity to the computer.
Yeah. Well, that's more of understanding the system you're working on.
System, yeah. Another good test. So getting into ignition waveforms, obviously that's with attachments and stuff, but checking. So another good test. Let's see here. I'm trying to think here.
Well, I think just, let's go over a couple of obstacles. So I think one of the major reasons that techs don't use scopes is it's intimidating, because there's service information doesn't have a scope pattern in it. Doesn't tell you how to hook up a scope. And I blame that on the manufacturers, because the manufacturers are not telling technicians how to hook up a scope. Some of the Asians are, and some of those patterns are great, but most of them are garbage.
Well, they'll give patterns, but they're not telling you how to hook it up. And that's a problem with going to some of the classes and stuff. And that's what I struggled with when I first started attending classes. The instructor would have a waveform up on the screen, and he's going over it. That's awesome. That I really like that presentation and everything else. But the problem is, when I first started going, I'm dumb to scope. So it's like, how did you get the waveform? Which wire did you go to? I mean, I need it, like, let's take like 10 steps back, because how did you get this up on the screen? And that's where it's good, somebody going over as far as, okay, yeah, the battery connection, a relative compression. You think it's going to be a whole lot more than it is, until you finally do it and you realize, man, it's 2 wires to the battery, no different than a meter or a battery tester or anything. And now you have this capture that tells you a lot. But that's a lot of the stuff is where did you hook up? How did you get this? Is black lead always on the ground? Or, there's still a lot of questions just having a picture up on the screen for a lot of guys. And that's how I was when I was first starting out. And I think most people are, unless they have more knowledge than I did.
Yeah. Well, when I first started using a scope, I was back in the 90s, and I've been working on cars a long time, I guess.
Yeah.
And that I worked at a shop that the very first shop I worked at had a oscilloscope that hung off the wall, off the ceiling.
Oh yeah. Yep.
And then I worked at another shop that we had one that it hung on the ceiling, but it pretty much walked you through the test. So
nice.
It would run a whole test. It was Allen Smart Tester, Smart Scope, or whatever they called it. And it would run you through a full ignition test. And for the most part, the only time guys were using scopes before, fuel injection became a thing was ignition related. There wasn't a whole lot of looking at other stuff. And I think the scope kind of migrated to the 5-volt sensors, the Hall effect sensors, sine wave sensors, and techs didn't grasp that. So the old guys that were doing it for ignition couldn't wrap their head around placing it on the Hall effect sensors. And once they did, they grasped it very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And then we went to the handheld scopes, and I started my first scope as a shop owner was a Master Tech,
Okay.
and it had a 2-channel scope
Yeah. Yep.
attachment that came with it, and it would set up some uh, basic settings for you to do some stuff. And we diagnosed a lot of cars with that back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and the guy that sold it to me encouraged me at that time to use it on cars that weren't broken and
Mm-hmm.
just stuff that was easy to get to. And so I was scoping mass airflow sensors, not understanding what I was looking at. But I finally got to a point with mass airflow sensors. These are early mass airflow sensors that
Yeah.
I could tell a bad one
Yeah.
real quick.
Yeah. Start like you're saying. So start with one test, get comfortable with that test, whether it be the battery charging system test, right? Um, like you said, turn the headlights on for a couple minutes, deplete the surface charge in the battery, start the engine. You can see the inrush, voltage and everything. And so start with one test, get comfortable with that. Stop, look at that capture, understand what's going on, wrap your mind around it. And that's what's nice about it, because that stores this information. So now you can, now you have a file and everything. You can really, I'm a visual learner. So I need, once I can see something, that's what I love about scopes. It's like, draw me a picture of what's going on.
It's like
yeah. Well, and putting a meter on there and doing the same kind of test, there's so much, I couldn't physically wrap my head around it and personally, until once I started understanding scopes, then electricity and everything else became a whole nother dynamic. And I really started visualizing what was going on. And now that I can see something that we normally can't see because it's electricity, and it's drawing us that picture, now I can be like, oh man, so here's the here's the inrush voltage, or current or whatever. And you can start dissecting that waveform, and things just started to click after I got familiar with the scope, more so than even a meter or anything else. If with a meter, I struggle, because there's times where, you're not seeing anything on the meter. Well, why is that? With a scope, you just keep probing. You're gonna find something. It's gonna come up on the screen and show you, eventually and stuff, depending on what you're on. So, but yeah, I think the easy test, get familiar with just one test, and then move on to another test. And that's how you learn. And even if it's 5-10 minutes a day, like you said, if they have a scope cart set up, one car a day, that may not be broken, just hook up one car a day in between oil changes, what have you, 5-10 minutes, and learn something different, on a different sensor, or doing the same tests on each vehicle and realizing how the differences. So Chevy 350 and the starting test is going to be different than a 4-cylinder Honda, right? There's going to be similarities, but the voltage peaks and everything else are going to be different. So understanding that, and it's like, oh man, so the amperage or voltage or whatever is going to be different, or it's not going to draw as much at first cranking, and you can really start putting things together.
I think it's about, personally, I think it's about ease of use and repetition.
Yep.
So you just keep doing the same thing over and over, and sooner or later you're going to get a bad one, and you're going to go, wait a minute, that looks funny.
I don't know how many fuel pumps that I tested. That was like, besides the battery and alternator ripple and stuff, that my next test, I ended up buying an amp clamp, and I wanted to test fuel pumps, and I was getting good waveforms, and I'm like, man, and here's the thing, it wasn't the fuel pumps, you know what I mean? Those fuel pumps were good and once I got a bad one, man, then you could really see the difference between that and the good one, because the good one's nice and clean, and the symmetrical humps and valleys and everything. And when I got a bad one, I was like, that's bad, So yeah, 100%, like you said, good charging, starting systems and everything, scope them. And then when you see that bad one, it's gonna stand out to you like a sore thumb, because you're used to looking at what they should look like.
Yeah. We got Zach coming in here.
What's up, Zach?
How we doing? He doesn't have his microphone on.
I think it's connecting right
Well,
now. What's up, man?
We were
Yeah,
having
no.
a discussion about getting shops to use scopes, and I just wondered if you had any ideas and what you do every day and trying to figure out if you got any ideas how to get shops to use the scopes. A lot of shops have scopes. Is there a better way to get them to start using their scopes?
yeah. So I think,
Ideas.
I know you and I were talking the other day about just like when you sell a scope, kind of starting off with the simple, easy tests. Here, let me move to a better location. It's not so dark. Um, and I think that starting them off with the easier stuff, the starting charging system stuff that you can. I think that's a good for anybody who's new to scopes, a good one because it's easy to wrap your mind around. Like it's not you're not dealing with you're not dealing with like a difficult setup or multiple channels to do like a cam crank correlation or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's more of an advanced guide test, personally. My point of the whole thing right now is just get them to use the scope. Don't get it out
Right.
of the minutes, understand the voltage setup, understand the time base, do a couple of quick, easy tests, and just get comfortable with what they're doing.
Yeah, and that's like, I think the voltage drop test for battery starter, and especially, I mean, you can start it with just that and then throw the current clamp in, but those are a fairly straightforward setup. It's easy to get repeatable results once you understand the settings. I think ripple voltage is another one that's good in that way because it doesn't take a lot of setup. And once you see what bad looks like, you spot it a mile away. It's not as nuanced as some of the more involved like drivability scope. And in a shop setting, an advantage they've got too is that if they're willing to do this, they can set it up on something, whether they dedicate a cart to it or a table. You come in the shop in the morning, turn that thing on, and just have it powered up, have a set of leads hooked up to it, ready to go, so that when you have an opportunity to use it, it's not as much of a setup process. You can grab it, go over to the vehicle and hook it up. And when you're flat rate, especially, anything that's going to slow you down, you immediately don't want to do. And I'm sure that is a big roadblock for a lot of guys, is that there's this learning curve that they're like, well, when am I going to have time to do that? I can diagnose this without it. And so they skip over it, but we're reaching a point where that's not going to be true anymore. You might be able to diagnose certain things, but if you're not proficient with the scope, it's going to pass you by, or you're going to end up just winging a bunch of parts at something. And so I think
Exactly.
starting with simple tests they can see the advantages of, for sure.
I think the newer cars are gonna demand scope usage. It's looking more and more like that's gonna happen. And I also think, from my experience with the newer cars, I'm saying 15 and newer, 16 and newer, we're starting to see problems where the computers will give you a code, but it's not related at all to the part you need to replace.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I'm seeing more and more of that in the newer cars than I ever did in the older stuff.
Yeah. Get a circuit code and there's a mechanical failure or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It seems more common. I agree.
That's, yep.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm trying to think. I almost wonder too, with some of it, is it helpful for some of these guys? They say they have a Zeus that's got a 4-channel scope on it, right? Like you've got a scope already, like you're saying, you can use it. But what if you say, all right, ignore that for now and, spend the, whatever it is now, $170 on a U scope. It's 1 channel. It's a switch to flip on. It's the setup is even though really the setup on any of them is going to be more or less the same, it's just learning the platform. Sometimes I wonder if it's like condensing it down into a more bite-sized platform if that makes it easier for somebody. And then once you've kind of mastered that, especially because the settings are just going to be basic oscilloscope settings, then when you get your hands on a Zeus or a Pico or something like that, where you've got a lot more ability, it's just scaling that up for a larger platform.
I personally, I don't like the idea of a U scope being the scope to start with. To me, it's too small of a screen. The setup is too clumsy. I like a PC-based scope, and I could see somebody using a U scope once they understand how to use a PC-based scope, and that's just my perspective. And but I came from, I used handheld scope for years, and then I went to a PC-based scope, and I went kicking and screaming to the PC-based scope from the handheld. I still like my handheld for certain things, but the PC-based scope was so much easier to use.
Yeah.
And
the U scope is a little clunky as far as for setup and everything else. So I understand what you're saying as far as that, Sam. So yeah, I mean, a cheaper PC-based scope is going to be a little bit easier to set up. And if you're mentioning to these guys, these shops, as far as like we were talking earlier, is having that scope cart set up. I think that's the biggest issue with why shops don't break out the scope, is because, man, it's cumbersome. It takes too long, is what I always hear. It takes too long.
I can have it diagnosed by the time I get that set up.
It doesn't take any longer than pulling out a meter if you have a scope cart. If you have 90% of what you need, and you just literally hooking up a couple leads and you're good to go. So that's really not a valid excuse anymore. Back in the day, yeah, I can understand that. And I was the same way until I got a scope cart, and next thing you know, I'm using my scope before grabbing any other tool, as far as, because it's right there, and it's like, okay, let's get that baseline on the starting charging. I'm not even using one of those, the cheaper battery testers anymore. I'm using the scope because it's giving me a more clear picture of what actually is going on, and it's loading loading the vehicle. The vehicle's, you're getting a better idea of what's happening. So
I personally think that Launch and Autel have kind of missed the boat with their newer scopes, because you can't put them on a PC anymore.
I know. That's a bummer. Yeah.
They've made it harder to use it all of a sudden. They think they made it easier, but they really made it harder to get set up and used.
And one thing I will say, so I mean, like, and I like having, there's times I like having my scope separate. Well, a lot of times I like having my scope separate than my scan tool. And with the Zeus or whatever, everything's in one. Well, I'll use the Zeus for the scope, and I'm using my Top Don for the scan tool, because I like I'm not having to flip between screens, or I'm not having to go in there and set it up as a guided component test, and then minimize that screen. And so sometimes it's just easier to like I said, I like having it separated more than having it all in one.
I'm a separate guy too, so I like things separate. I like my J box being a J box, not a scanner with a J box.
Yeah, exactly.
With my scope. And yes, there is some convenience. There is times that I'll use my my tablet-based scope, but for the most part, it's too cumbersome to get set up.
Yeah,
in my opinion. And that just takes it, so it's harder for the guys to get it out of the box and get some
just more excuses. And trust me, and we know, for us being mobile and stuff, we are like the shops that I'm like the last person to grab a scope now, compared to if I was still at the shop and had that cart and everything else. Like I said, I was using it all day, every day. Now I'm grabbing what's most convenient for myself.
It takes too much to get it out of the van.
It takes too much to get out now.
I'm the same way, but I don't do very much diagnostics anymore. So if I'm going to a shop to do diagnostics today, it's not a big deal. I just get the scope out, we'll set it up, and it's just part of the deal.
Yep.
because I know when I'm going to do a diagnostics, I'm taking my scope. It's going to require a scope.
Yeah. And I will say, so even us, just to touch on us being mobile and stuff, so like my van and Zach setting his van up, I have I have the lead hooks and magnetized to the side of my van. So all my leads, they're 10-foot leads, they're hanging there. And so they're not wrapped up or anything else. So in reality, I kind of have a scope cart. I don't have to take out the leads and everything else. I literally have to grab the scope or the PC or whatever and grab the leads and I'm good to go. So I tried to, excuse me, I tried to make it as easy as possible because I knew that was going to be an issue being mobile, where I would grab it less and less. So, and I still love using the scope all the time and staying familiar with it and everything. So,
yeah, I'd like to say I think that I think it's a shame that they did that with the scope. And
yeah, hopefully.
I also think that's one of the reasons guys don't use their snap-on scope as much, is because they use it as a scanner, and then to use it as a scope, they got to go find the leads and get everything set up. And I don't know, it's just my opinion. I personally would rather see a shop using $120 Pantech scope and go in there and have the leads just falling apart because of overuse than I would see a guy using a snap-on scope with brand new leads.
Yeah.
And that's, that's my opinion about it, I guess. So, all right, we're kind of getting to the limit of what I was trying to get accomplished here tonight. So, I probably am going to do some minor editing on this and put it on YouTube and iHeartRadio. But I'm going to take a few parts out of it here.
Okay.
So, you got anything you want to add? I know we got Thomas Irving in here, and I don't know where Thomas is from. I'm assuming he was my Instagram follower.
Yes, that's me.
So,
how you doing, Thomas?
I'm doing good.
I sent you the invite there, Thomas.
You did.
So you've been kind of in and out of the conversation here tonight. You got anything you want to add? We're talking about getting shops to use their scopes that they have and some tests. I don't know if you follow me on YouTube or not, but that's the whole goal of my current scheme on YouTube, is getting guys to use their scopes.
So I've been following you on YouTube for a few years, and a few other people. I finally went and I bought a scope and made a cart, and I love using a scope, but to try to get anybody else in the shop to use a scope is like pulling teeth.
Oh yeah.
Well,
I use two different
scope,
kinds
the other
of
guys will start using it too.
But that's the first thing I grab when I do diagnostic is a scan tool and a scope. So
it's the way that makes this most sense. So,
and how is your success rate now that using the scope and everything, Thomas, as far as on the diags?
So on where I work at Christian Brothers is I use video photography and stuff. So I'm able to record all my testing. So it goes into a database. So if there's ever a problem with that car or I need history on that car, everything is back to, you had a check engine light. You had a misfire. This is the relative compression test. This is the in cylinder. This is how I made the diag. So there's no problems. But the scope is about, I would say, a 90% success rate. I think the only limiting part is your knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what it comes down to. But the more you use the scope, I think the more you think about different tests. You think, hey, I could test this doing this, and it may not be a quote unquote standard test. I had one several years ago that customer's complaint was the engine would stall when the air conditioning was on, and I couldn't wrap my head around why the car would stall when the air conditioning was on. Well, it turned out that the armature on the blower fan had a flat spot in it, and it was causing noise on the communication line. It was actually causing the vehicle to stall, and I found it with the amp clamp and a scope. It was pretty interesting, and but it was a real sensitive car. I thought for what it was an Audi, and I amp clamped the blower fan just out of curiosity to see what it looked like. And as soon as I unplugged it, we couldn't get the car to stall anymore.
Oh, interesting.
It was really interesting. But you
Yeah.
think stuff like that when you use a scope, you think about, hey, let's just check that real quick.
The funny part is once you
Yeah.
start using a scope, you just go broke because there's just like a million things you either want to build or buy.
Yep. Yeah, it's another toy or another tool that needs feeding, because you can buy more accessories for a scope than you can ever afford.
Yeah, and that is true. And there's a lot of attachments that I have purchased that didn't give me a return on investment, but then there's others like the WPS, or look at Joe's sensors right there. That's a great investment right there, and they're cheap. They're a cheaper attachment than a lot of other things on the market.
Totally.
Like the WPS, that was probably one of my I didn't know how long I would get a return on investment on that, but man, now that I have it, I'm not pulling an oxygen sensor ever again. You know what I mean? For an exhaust back pressure test. And so that right there has saved my butt plenty of times. Yeah. And you physically can out there.
Yeah, no kidding.
It takes 30 minutes.
Yeah. With a torch in hand too.
Torch, air chisel, and sometimes you got to put a pipe on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like mandatory up there, I would think, just because of the rust and stuff like that. That's
right.
Yeah. No, and that some tools like that for sure. I mean, I'm sure depending on how much drivability you do, something like a WPS is pays for itself in a pretty reasonable amount of time. But even if not, it's the kind of tool that when you need it, and it's so worth what it costs that it's like it doesn't matter if you use it once a year or twice a year. It's like having it when you need it is so valuable that it's just it can't really even be calculated in those situations. No different than any of the other tools we have for stuff like that, where you just it saves the day.
One of the big things that I was using my WPS for, I don't even have one right now, but because I don't do diagnostics anymore, I had sold my Pico scope with the WPS. One of the things I would use it for all the time is injector flow rate testing, just plugging it into the Schrader valve on a fuel rail and being able to see the injectors opening. And it's just a simple test, just a quick, simple test to get a misfire. What's the injectors doing? And it was easy to figure out, hey, this injector is not participating.
Yep.
And then start looking for, is it getting voltage? Is it getting, or is it just plugged?
Right.
Exactly. Well, and just like what you showed just a second ago with Joe's noise detection tool, that's a fairly cheap tool. And now we can take, noises in vehicles and actually produce a waveform to where we can physically see it. And so sky's the limit once you start using a scope. And like you were talking about earlier, Sam, it's you can find different testing techniques utilizing the scope, and we're all, I think we're all to a point visual learners and everything, and noises always drove me crazy. And even the chassis ears, putting the chassis ears on and everything else, it's like, well, is it louder here or is it louder here? Because sometimes you just don't know. But I mean, when you have a physical waveform that you can compare, right, and moving those ears around and seeing it on a screen to confirm that it is louder here and not so much there, because my ears aren't what they used to be. But breaking out a scope, man, you know, and having those captures and stuff, it's just it's a cool way to it's not just electricity anymore that we're testing with them.
Right.
Well, we're getting to the end of this. I thank everybody for joining, having the discussion. I think it was worthwhile discussion. And if you got anything to add, just shoot me a message or something. And, you know, we can have a further discussion about accessories for scopes later on down the road, some more advanced tests, kind of where the scope can take you at another point. But I think this is a good discussion for getting the scope out of the box right now. So, all right. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you guys.
Sounds
Talk
good.
to you later.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Later.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
You too.